I really like to be called the New Frontier panel. It sounds really nice. Bonjour. I thought as we are in Canada and this is a bilingual country, this panel is in French. No, it's not. I'm very happy to introduce you to our speakers today on the subject of fueling the innovation. We have 4 panelists today who come from very different walks of life, so we'll have very different angles on this question of innovation. We have Naveen, who's the Director General for Sanofi Canada. We don't have the names in front of us, so I'll go in the order here. Laila, who is the CEO of Terawatt Initiative. We have Sarah Kaplan, who's a professor and director of the Institute for Gender and the Economy, University of Toronto. And Daker, who you've seen yesterday, for those who were here yesterday, professor and co-director of Greater Good Science. I understand the winner of the debate as well yesterday. So we'll have since it's a panel on biases, we thought we would dispel right away the first bias in a description of the panel that you had, that innovation is slowing down. It is true there have been some publications according to traditional measures like GDP growth or productivity indices that innovation seems to be slowing down. However, what we're finding increasingly is innovation cannot just be captured by the traditional measures like GDP growth. In fact, I would argue that some of the innovation is slowing GDP. Think about an entire generation of young people who stop paying phone bills to actually move on to messaging apps. That would actually decrease GDP. So the first part of this question we wanted to say is, how do you measure the pace of innovation? And there have been a number of measures used in the past. You know, how many years did it take for a technology to reach certain people? We knew it took the telephone 45 years to reach 60% of the population. The clothing washer machine, 30 years. The internet, 15. I would argue the blockchain might take 10 maybe, or 5. So let's start maybe with you, Naveen, on you work in a field which has traditionally probably been the highest percentage, dedicating the highest percentage of resources to research and develop. Is innovation slowing down? What's your take? And then I'll ask the other panelists to step in.
Thank you, Estelle. Thank you so much. A very, very interesting topic. And let me assure you that in our industry, the pace of innovation has not slowed down. We're moving from a world where a medicine was used to treat symptoms and diseases into a world where we can anticipate and even take actions before diseases affect patients. The sequencing of human genome, biotechnology, digital revolution, all bring and offer tremendous prospects. Let me give you an example of a recent innovation medicine that we have developed with our partners, Regeneron, a biotech company, Dupixent. And Dupixent, we've realized action is on 2 different targets at once. And therefore, these targets, they do cause a series of allergic reactions, such as eczema, asthma, even food allergies at once. And therefore, Dupixent is one of the first, I would say, dual-action antibodies that would treat the root cause of these diseases rather than just treat the symptoms. But let me stress on innovation is not only in medicines. We are going beyond innovative medicines and beyond medicines to harness the power of digital technologies. You mentioned them in the opening: artificial intelligence, machine learning, big data collected and gathered from electronic medical records across the world, biotechnology. These are even connecting devices and applications that are truly transforming the delivery of healthcare. And here I would like to talk about our partnership with Google. The joint venture between Sanofi and Verily on Duo for disease management, where we're bringing in Sanofi's pharmaceutical expertise with Verily's expertise in electronics, analytics, but also consumer software development. And it's a virtual diabetes clinic in an application platform that offers the patient, people living with diabetes, to put in its data, daily activities, food intakes, all of this. And therefore, with the analytics, it provides a real-life coach, tailored advice on spontaneously, and therefore empower the patients into truly how can they manage and control their disease.
So thank you for bringing up all those new technologies that somehow converge suddenly. Anything on your side that you've seen in terms of the context for the innovation? Is it speeding up? What's going on? Why is this, what's the reality out there?
I think we are actually at the dawn of the next generation of our ability to innovate. So if you look at kind of the last big step change happened in the beginning of last century when we developed the engine, basically, and the myriad of innovations that happened after that because of that. And before that, you know, the printing press that allowed us to share ideas and created a huge influx of innovation, you know, starting from with people like Leonardo da Vinci. I think what happened with the internet and now with advances in AI, we're at an incredible place. So if you look at just the innovations that happened in the last, 10, 15 years, or that accelerated. So we're giving birth to artificial intelligence, one of them. The other one of them is CRISPR technology, a technology that was developed across the ocean by a woman in France and a woman at Berkeley.
Hold the microphone closer.
Those are just a couple of examples of what's happening. The innovation is actually increasing in pace, and what we are struggling with as a society is actually keeping up with that innovation, understanding the ultimate effects of it, and where we're actually heading with the innovation that we are developing. In the last century, we developed the engine, and look at what we've done to the planet 100 years later. Now we're looking at AI, gene manipulation, robotics, and one of the things that, and the main thing that we have to be thinking about is not whether the innovation is slowing down, but what is it doing to us as a society, and what the outcomes are going to come out of it.
I have a panelist who's ready to jump here. I see him nodding.
Yeah, no. So I've had the chance to work at Facebook or consult with Facebook as a social scientist, and then at Google and Apple. And I think one of the really important ways that we could think about innovation is to what extent is it spreading knowledge and new ideas and innovating the minds of the people who use them. And I speak to a lot of audiences that are very sort of dispirited about the state of our youth, but what we know about young people and their technological immersion is that they know a lot more than a generation ago, in part through the new technologies. But it does raise this really interesting question of what is the content of the knowledge, who edits it, who serves as peer review, if you will. I was recently, had the privilege of traveling in Bhutan, which was a country that was one of the latest to adopt all the new technologies. It's still, Wi-Fi is still very sketchy there. And my 20-year-old daughter and our guide were debating politics thanks to the new technology. So there's a lot of social, intellectual innovation that really has to take advantage of the new technologies.
But I like what Laila, you said about, the steam engine didn't really have an effect on our brains, or on social fabric, on how families interact, or our health. Whereas today the technology is much more pervasive, and we're just starting to scratch the frontier where it's heading. Now, we're here in the context of the G7 as well, and Lala, you shared with me that you have a hypothesis why innovation is different now, and maybe it's something that countries should think about so that we continue investing in terms of just purely the funds that are running through innovation.
Yeah, I think, so there's a cycle to innovation. Innovation lives initially in a lab. So if we look at the innovations of the past century, a couple of really big things that we know about, going to the moon or inventing the internet, both of them actually originated with public money, right? So NASA and DARPA were behind those technologies when they were too early to productize, to make money out of. right? So that first cycle is really, really important, because if we don't invest into these big ideas early, they will never come to exist, because for corporations it's just not viable enough to go after them. Now, once these technologies become viable, commercially viable, then the venture capital and corporate finance and private equity, all of this money is going to flow in, because at this point this technology can be taken to the consumers. So we're doing really well nowadays in venture capital and equity. And Silicon Valley, as we all know, but it's not just in Silicon Valley, it's actually across the world now. There's a lot of investment. However, when we think about the investments that need to be made globally at this particular point in time, so let's look at ecology for instance, right? Our biggest problem right now isn't really going to Mars, it's saving this planet. You know, Stephen Hawking famously, right before he died, basically said, you know, time to go. But you know, out of the 10 million that are going to be on this planet, we need to figure out how to make this planet viable for survival. And in order to do that, the G7 countries really need to think about what institutions do we need to build and invest in order to make sure that we solve the problem of the 21st century. And how do we solve it? It's not going to be one country with one DARPA. It's going to have to be an institution that we invest in collectively to develop the next generation.
I think, Sarah?
Well, I just wanted to add to this conversation, because when we talk about innovation, the conversation so far has been very heavily focused on technology and, you know, thinking about all the different technological innovations. But in fact, some of the most important innovations are actually in processes, in systems, and other kinds of things like that. When you look at some of the most important global health issues, the challenge is not technology, the challenge is management. And I may be selfishly saying this as a management scholar at a business school, but I think when we talk about innovation, I think we also have to think about all the other forms of innovation that are not just purely the technology in the lab. And I think that would help us think more about some of the inclusiveness issues that I know we want to turn to next in the conversation.
Scalability, what comes to mind when you mention that is how the Gates Foundation has created a revolution in terms of picking one issue and pushing it very, very hard with very different processes.
I would like just to add on this one as well. I agree to your point, it's processes and management, but as well on the accessibility and the access issues in healthcare to patient access these innovation. So it's interesting to have those high, very fast-paced innovation, but if it doesn't impact patients' lives, those can't be classified as innovation. So that also in itself requires innovative solutions and of course diversity and inclusion to ensure there is a collaboration between different stakeholders.
So it's a perfect segue to the next part of the conversation, which is really about, is that technology or that innovation creating in itself non-inclusiveness? Are there biases that are deeply embedded into the way the teams that develop and work on that innovation, the data we use, the way we have coded it? And what I'm going to do here is call on the four of our panelists, because they all have different angles on this issue. I might start again with you, Laila, on artificial intelligence in particular. A few months ago, scientists had to unplug physically two computers when those started developing a language that for the first time humans could not decode. Things like that are happening fast and create all kinds of issues on artificial intelligence. So, Laila, what are you seeing in terms of, can you give us some very concrete examples of biases and embedded in the way we've actually built those technologies?
Yeah, so I just taking a little bit of a step back. For the way artificial intelligence works, it effectively uses the data points that it observes. Just like a young human. A young child will observe a lot of different activities or images, and it will make its own conclusions based on those. And then it applies basically algorithms on top of that to kind of narrow the outcomes. So artificial intelligence is just like a young child's brain. If a young child sees that on the TV, that all men in shrubs are doctors and all women in shrubs, it's our early conversation, are nurses, then it will interpret. The child, as she grows up, will continue to interpret. Every time she sees a woman in shrubs, she's going to think it's a nurse. She's a nurse. So artificial intelligence works exactly the same way, and some of the bloopers of artificial intelligence that came out in just the last couple of years, so for example, Google's algorithm, when they, the first version of it, when they trained it to recognize images, because they did not include African Americans in the image pool, the algorithm started to recognize those pictures as gorillas, for example. And there have been numerous examples of these throughout the last couple of years. Facebook algorithms started to spew out fake news, basically, at the users, just because those were the news that were popular. But of course, the users didn't know what kind of news they were. So the problem is not just that there's a bias, but once this bias is, we all have it as human beings, but once it's embedded into software, it self-perpetuates. And algorithms are not transparent, which means we cannot go back and analyze how did the algorithm come to understand the world this way, or how did it make the decision. And what people don't realize is that AI is all around us at this point. The path that you take when you drive today here is an AI algorithm. In the United States, there are now, in the court system, the scoring that is used for what's the length of the sentence to give to a particular person is established by an AI algorithm. So we are in the middle of an AI pervasive explosion. And one of the most important things that we need to understand is how it is mimicking the world that we live in. And how conscious we need to be. We need to include our frontal cortex into really making decisions about it.
It's interesting because you could argue, what is the world you want to live in, and therefore how would you create the biases the other way? Which makes me think that in a world where people watch their cell phones and their platforms 200 times a day on average, and where the average teenager by breakfast has already answered 300 messages, those tools become even more important as our source of information, intelligence, emotions sometimes. You've worked with Google and Facebook, and not so much on the data, but on the design of those tools. Can you tell us a little bit about the biases embedded there?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that not only should we be thinking about the data biases that feed into machine learning, like Lila is saying, but we should be thinking about the fields that contribute to the design of these platforms. I was brought into Facebook 7 years ago, and also Google, because I study human emotion and kindness and compassion at Berkeley. Literally with the charge, I was brought in with a female manager to make Facebook more compassionate. You can see how well we did with that one. It stunned me. There were no social scientists really and now there are lots of social scientists, a lot of women coming out of sociology, psychology, computer science that are helping conceptualize. And what that meant was the concepts for the platform were biased as well as the data. So first problem we worked on was called social resolution tools, where you would try to solve a conflict with somebody at Facebook. And the language that they used was very direct and adversarial. And we brought in this science of linguistics and said, a lot of people like to speak more cooperatively and kindly with each other, and they're like, what are you talking about? It should be as minimal and small number of words as possible. And that proved to be really well. Then we introduced an even more radical idea. People really like to express their emotions to each other. And they're like, define emotion, or whatever it was. And so we ended up saying, there's this, and again, this was, I will say, the most radical, innovative ideas were by female scientists down at Facebook, one being Facebook should care more about the well-being of people than how long they spend on the site, which was a woman's contribution. But so we helped redesign emojis and reactions to be more emotionally rich. So I think there are massive conceptual biases alongside data biases that just stun me, but are opportunities for the future.
Very interesting to think that the only emotion you can express on Facebook used to be thumb up, and that's it, right? And that's about the range of emotions. Yeah. This will have a huge impact on the future of work, and I'd like to end with that. But before that, I think in healthcare, the biases are numerous and they're changing too, but I was looking at, people argued, for example, that breast cancer would have been solved earlier if more women scientists had been involved. I was looking as well at statistics on For example, lung cancer for non-smoking women has a much higher incidence for women than for men. Yet no clinical trial until very recently was splitting gender as a result of the clinical trial. So things like that will have an influence. How do you deal with that, and how do you make sure that there are no biases either in the teams or in the way the tools you use and the processes you use as you develop solutions for the world?
It's a very, very interesting topic, and it's a big challenge. But it's very important here to talk about how important it is to match the real population, right? So it's very important. It speaks to the clinical trials, but it speaks to a lot of other things. Even when you want to innovate for solutions for any disease as well, you need to understand the patient journey, and that becomes very, very important. So when it comes to clinical trials, I'll give you an example that has also with technology. We work closely with a company that is called Science 37, and that uses mobile technology and telemedicine to support site-less clinical trials. What does this mean? It encourages more patients to contribute and participate. And here it will favor women, of course, because for remote women, they don't need to move around to the site. And therefore, remotely, they can report through the application their data to the doctors, and that is going to speed the clinical trial. It also speeds the time of the clinical trial at up to 2 years. So when we consider almost 12 years for a product development, 2 years is impactful. So that can be an important area. Other important areas is the engagement, and to ensure that we are also inclusive in innovating the solutions, right? This is where it's very, very important to match the market needs, but the market representation as well. And I think we're going to speak to it.
We're going to speak about the solutions, but and not last, because this is such an important aspect of technologies, is as we get all connected, we think we can work from anywhere, we can contribute from everywhere, the mobility, and I know, Sarah, you wanted to speak about the gig economy and this great new way of working that seems to be ideal and is probably not so ideal. So tell us a little bit about what that technology creates in terms of the social fabric of who we are as well.
Right. Well, I think that a lot of the conversation around some of these new emerging technologies and these increasing algorithms and all these kinds of things, this seems like a wonderful thing that could potentially improve our economies, but we have to think about the jobs that get replaced. And the research seems to suggest that over the next 10 years, more than half of the jobs replaced are going to be women's jobs, so 57%. So when we start to think about automation and its impact on the economy and on workers, it's going to have a disproportionately negative effect on women. Then the second aspect is they say, oh, we have these great, gig economy. It's going to lead to all sorts of great opportunities for women. And I pulled out, just because I think this gets perpetuated by the media. The Globe and Mail said, for women and children, the gig economy is a means of balancing family duties and fulfilling professional career. The gig economy gives women options to scale up or down as necessary, et cetera, et cetera. And so first of all, what a bummer that we only expect women to be flexible. So I'll just put that on the side, because why is it that women have to bear all that flexibility? But the second thing is the gig economy is not necessarily so great. There are some aspects of the gig economy like no supplemental health insurance, no retirement, and no guarantee of work, precarious work. And so when we fantasize that somehow this gig economy is going to be so great for women, we forget that those jobs are actually not great jobs. And what we really need are great, well-paying, secure jobs with benefits and things like that, and better child care and better elder care. And instead of saying, well, we don't have good child care and elder care, so let's force women into the gig economy. I'm not sure that's the right solution. And I don't want to, I'm always going to be maybe the Debbie Downer on technology. I don't want to think, that somehow technology is magically going to solve these problems. We have to think about the social problems that the technology is also creating.
So let's think. What are the solutions, either in outcomes or in processes? What can be done now, personally, as a group, as stakeholders, speaking to stakeholders? What is it, if you had a couple of solutions you would suggest we start with? I know, Naveen, you wanted to intervene on this one, and then we'll just go around, and I think if everyone can also jump in. very concrete examples of what could be done to actually make sure that we are aware of those biases, and then we start solving them as we go along, or we imagine the world we want to live in.
So, thank you, Estelle. I will take you through why, as an organization, Sanofi, we are fully committed to the diversity and inclusion and the gender balance. There's 4 main reasons, and that will explain the solutions. The first, it is a business imperative. And I think we've talked about the data, it's a statistically proven driving performance and results, where companies that have 50% of their executive roles are women, they do achieve 19% higher on return on equity. The second reason, which is very important, innovation needs diversity. Diversity is the engine that drives innovation. Innovation is created when we have different perspectives, different solutions, and different ideas. The third, which is very important for us in our industry especially, is to match our market and customers' need. What does this mean? Women are playing more and more important roles. They are the chief medical officers of their own houses. They take decisions in healthcare of children, of their children, husband, aging parents, sisters, brothers. Not only that, we saw the great example of the Canadian government where authorities, 50% of the cabinet are women, and therefore decision makers are also including and have the inclusion. University graduates as well and medical doctors, they are more than 60% are women. So therefore, to come back to the issue, the first problem, this is very important to ensure that we do match and understand those needs, and therefore put in a diverse portfolio of solutions to ensure a better, sustainable healthcare systems. The last but not least is a very, very important, which is a core part of our talent strategy. How do we make sure we are competing in a world that has a war for talents by dropping 50% of the pool? That cannot be feasible, of course.
So the diversity of the workforce as a solution to being able to actually be more creative and innovative there. Other solutions?
I think we need to have diversity of thought and ability to empathize. The ability for empathy we're losing with this. As the world becomes more interconnected, we're losing our human abilities in many ways, or our humanity. So we need to find ways to preserve it further. And find ways to understand each other. Because one thing that technology can really do is to widen the gap. Right, so that the top medical solutions are only available for the rich, right? The top technologies are only available for the rich. Meanwhile, we're removing the jobs for the bottom 50% of the population. So from the G7's point of view and from the institution's point of view, we need to really rethink how we do our business in the next century. So if I'm the World Bank, for example, I need to think about how I'm doing my investments and maybe actually spur innovation in Africa or Asia, and think about how do I create innovative centers for people there, because people in Silicon Valley don't really know what life is in Africa is like. Right? If I am a G7 country, I need to think about what does it mean to have most of the jobs performed by robots in the next century? What does it mean for the population? How do we care for everybody's health? Do we need a universal health program? In the United States, we actually don't have it. Do we need the universal education program? You know, what are some of the things that we need to put in place as fundamental human rights, like access to clean water and clean air, and what technology is involved in making that happen in the next century?
So institutions and policies would be one piece of the equation, and I know, Sarah, you're willing to jump in as well.
Well, I wanted to pick up on this idea about the diversity and the diversity of thought, because some of the latest research is suggesting that that's not nearly enough. We think of diversity and then we just want to sprinkle women or sprinkle people of color on our existing system and think we're going to get something. And also that language around diversity of thought can lead to, I think it was the Google executive who recently said, well, diversity of thought is what we're going for. I could have a room with 12 white men and it could be diverse because they come from different backgrounds. So I don't think that's what we're talking about. And the diversity of thought language is actually being co-opted by people who are fighting against what we would consider actual true inclusiveness. So I think we need to move the conversation towards inclusiveness, because you don't get the benefit of the diversity in any of these diverse teams that we're talking about unless you also have inclusive practices. And one of the things we know about inclusion is it's not something that you just get overnight. It takes a while to build up that muscle. It's like a little bit like you start going to the gym. It's not like the first day you go to the gym that you suddenly have like the six-pack abs. Like, it takes work, and you have to do it over time, right? And so we need to exercise that inclusive muscle, which is overcoming some of the discomfort that comes from being with people who are different and things like that. In the Canadian context, we are, in terms of specific policy things, we have the Supercluster Initiative, we have in Toronto the Toronto Waterloo Corridor, and nowhere in those conversations, inclusiveness is not rising up to the top of those conversations. And when you ask people about it, they kind of look down at their shoes because they don't know what to say. So I think one of the things we need to do is put inclusiveness at the top of the innovation agenda and not as a separate conversation from the innovation conversation, which is why I love that we're having this panel, because I think people think of them as two separate things when in fact they are actually intimately interrelated. And the fact that we have a venture capital culture, whether it's Silicon Valley or it's Toronto, that's male dominated and white dominated, that's hugely problematic. We need to have both. So both at the organizational level and the policy level, inclusiveness and those practices need to be at the top of the agenda, not buried somewhere down at the bottom.
It reminds me of the discussion yesterday where people saying it's not another floor you're adding, it's in the cement of embedding it very early on. Now, beyond more emojis, any other ideas about how those who touch our lives earlier from a design point of view can actually remove those biases, and what you would suggest?
Yeah, I would amplify what Lila said. I think we need a serious gendered critique of the new social media platforms, and I know they exist out there, but it needs to be concerted. The 7 years that I've been sort of dropping in on these different places, one thing that strikes me is, no surprise to this audience, a lot of the serious problems, gender problems, just reproduce themselves online. So a lot of the harassment and trolling is only amplified. And it caught a lot of the new social media platforms off guard that this would happen. A gender critique will really bring that to the attention. Likewise, a serious gender analysis, what I've found is it introduces the opportunities for growth and change. A lot of the exciting work at Google that I've seen is coming out of this empathy lab built by Daniel Kredic, a woman, and it really is bringing in, like you said, a new way of thinking about the kinds of communities that are built, because they're biased to begin with. So I'd really encourage a concerted gender critique that brings these problems and opportunities to the attention of stakeholders.
Yeah, and I like the idea of the new values getting embedded. If you take the work of Google, the best and most creative teams were the ones where people could show their vulnerability, which is not a word we hear very often in the business world, right? I want to leave some time for questions, but I wanted to end with one last question on, as we go through those, we talked about policies and so on, you worrying about it, you might lose sleep over it, but who else does? And there is a lot of discussions right now about the need for a place where those ethical frameworks get discussed, get debated, and where things get implemented. On artificial intelligence, I've seen initiatives in Montreal. We have the Metayer lab with the scientists who want to own that conversation. You're saying maybe institutions should also be part of that. So where is that ethical discussion going to take place, and is it actually taking place today?
You want me to?
Go ahead, you were smiling.
So, I was smiling. I have some thoughts. So first I would say those conversations should be happening everywhere. As I said, whether it's the people who are organizing the Toronto Waterloo Corridor, the people who are organizing the individual superclusters, individual corporations that are developing AI, if that conversation is not an explicit part of the leadership agenda, that's hugely problematic. Yeah. We're trying to do it at the Rotman School when we teach our MBAs. I'm in the middle of teaching a course right now that's forcing the students to put the other stakeholders on the agenda. So I actually think that I don't want to say, oh, there should be some organization that does it for us. I think actually we are all implicated and we should all be doing that. Now, there's probably also a place for some specific, areas of expertise and excellence on this, but I don't think we can abdicate I think everyone at every different level needs to be having that conversation.
I think we have to face it. This conversation is actually happening. It's just not happening in the way that that we've planned it. So if you look at the last election in the United States, that's a reflection of this conversation. It's people who are feeling that they're being left behind by the technological advances that are happening everywhere, and people are voting on that. I think the conversation that really needs to happen is how do we plan forward for what is happening, and that's a public debate. It absolutely has to include everyone.
Anything to add to that in terms of what else is to be happened? So, but maybe it's a good time to open the floor to questions or comments. I think we're going to maybe start with you. You have the microphones, and Mrs. Ramos you want to intervene, and as part of the OECD has a statement as well in terms of those biases that you're finding in technology. And then we'll open to the rest of the room as well.
Actually, I want to comment the panel.
Can we make sure she has the microphone?
I'm good. I'm good. Thank you. No, I wanted to commend the panel because I think that this is a very complex topic, and you have brought a lot of passion to it and very easy way to understand. I have to say that being an organization that is focusing on better policies for better lives, the OECD is actually trying to see how do we match the technology 0.4 or 0.5 or 0.6 with policy making 0.1. Which is exactly what is happening. This is not only about the speed, as you mentioned, it's about the pervasiveness, it's about touching everything we do, and how do we ensure that the frameworks, the institutional frameworks, the policy areas, the thinking, what we do, are really up to speed to respond to the challenges. And I think you all put it in a way that was pretty convincing in the sense that there is a promising opportunity for all these things, to leapfrog, for countries to leapfrog with 3D printing, for women to take advantage of flexibility, or for men to take advantage of flexibility, to really look for how these new innovations serve humans, which is the whole purpose of the thing. And the fact is that sometimes we feel that technology serves its own purpose, and the innovators serve their own purpose, and the reality is how do we control the downsides of these issues. The OECD is developing a digital strategy which is trying to look at all of these issues. How is it going to impact skills? How is it going to impact the labor markets? How is it going to impact the scientific community? All these things are very important, and what you mentioned, the inclusive angle. Not opening another digital divide, which already exists, because we're here in the G7 happily talking about digital divides. Take a look at the world and how many millions of people are not even connected and don't have broadband. In my country, there are 50 million Mexican who are not yet connected, even though there are very great advances on this topic. Which jobs are going to be replaced? How do we speed up the capacity of institutions to anticipate? We know that 14% of jobs are going to disappear, but almost 40% are going to change in content. And therefore, how do we upgrade that? The education systems, are we going to continue translating information when the information is the thing that we have just massively? How do we develop the critical thinking in kids, the self-confidence, their own decisions, and to recognize their own biases? This is very complex because this is not happening. It's just not happening. So I think this is a very important point. What I missed in terms of the conversation is where do we go with big data? We need data about data. Who owns the data? Who governs the data? Who uses the data? Because what is happening is if we don't look in those issues, this data is being used by those big platforms that are the ones that are gathering it to feed up the next artificial intelligence developments that are going to just be completely out of reach of anybody. And then the gender angle. I think the gender angle is just very worrisome. You also have touched upon that. I think that the development of the software, women are not represented. The kind of venture capital they receive for innovation is much lower than men. You have still 200 women less connected to the internet than men. 80% of the patents are made by groups of men, not representing women. Of course, there are increases in terms of patents that developed by women. So these questions are the hard questions. And then I would say something else. I'm following the gender agenda And we're always very worried about the unconscious bias that we are always representing. And we had these conversations, Sarah and Sarah, how you change your mind. I don't know if you change it, but you need to at least change the incentives and make it visible that this is a question. I think that the kind of reproduction of these biases in the social networks is very damaging. And now we have proof in the PISA report of the OECD, which is the education performance of students, girls feel harassed by the social media and by the reproduction of images that happen around that. So these are questions that I would like to pose to the panel because these are the real issues.
Thank you. One of the reasons why we didn't talk about data is there was a panel on data yesterday, so that issue had been debated, but I'd like to bounce on the pipeline, because we haven't addressed that in this notion here. In Canada, we graduate 2,000 students in artificial intelligence. We need 50,000. So tell us about the pipeline a little bit. I know, Dakan, you had something to say about the pipeline, and are we going to actually be ready to have the right people at those jobs transform?
Well, one thing that I would, for the younger people in the audience, I would just, I will say very pragmatically, living near Silicon Valley is social science, basic research, learn a little bit of statistics. That's going to be a central pipeline for innovation into the big companies in Silicon Valley, and I think it's going to be a platform for people to ask, for example, the question that you posed, which is how can we use these data, big data, for social good? I've been in conversations at Google and Facebook where the data they have could prevent epidemics, it could prevent forms of racism, hate crime, sexual assault pretty easily, right? I think good social scientists on hand would solve that problem, and that's going to be I see it happening when I visit. That's a major pipeline into that industry that's going to grow pretty dramatically.
This morning came out the new book for high school students in China, and artificial intelligence is now one of the themes and topics of starting at primary school, which is very interesting about how we think about preparing our workforce. Sarah, you wanted to add something?
I just wanted to make a quick point because as a social scientist, I'm thrilled to hear the recommendation there should be more social scientists, but I also think a lot of organizations say that they can't find, when they say, well, you should hire more women or people of color into technology, they say they can't find the pipeline. But recent research is suggesting that when female students do for example, their internships, engineering students, their internships in companies, if they do it early enough in their academic career, they will actually change their major into something else because they're having experiences in companies that are not consistent to the kind of work experience they want. And so when companies say they don't have a pipeline, I think that companies are producing that problematic pipeline and that they can't lay it off on schools. I think they have to lay it on to the environment that they're creating that is actually making those careers look unattractive to precisely the people they feel like they should be including. So I just wanted to add that to the conversation.
Very interesting. In corporations, we're finding what we need now is anthropologists, as much as computer scientists, for example.
I think that said, we do see a major drop-off in STEM of female students, especially mathematics, which is where what is really behind artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is just math. And we don't see enough women continuing through with it. So we do need to encourage and find ways to incentivize women to stay within those areas. We also need to create opportunities around the world for this, because it can't be that just Europe, China, and maybe a little bit of North America is producing these AI students. So inclusiveness, not only gender inclusiveness, but regional inclusiveness, also is very, very important for this, to even this out. That said, I actually think that we're going to see a marriage of cognitive sciences and AI, because it's approaching the same problem of effectively digitally modeling human brain from two different angles, and both of them are just as important. Both of those perspectives are very, very important. So as we start to evolve the field, I think it's going to become much more interdisciplinary, and it's going to start at a college level.
Very good. We have 6 minutes left. What I wanted to do is get a chance to get a few questions and then give a chance to the panelists to have the 30-second conclusion. What I'm going to do for the questions, I see quite a few hands. I'm going to take all the questions in a row. So keep them please brief, and you will not get to hold the microphone. People will hold it for you. Ask your questions, stay brief. I'll take 4 or 5 questions, and I'll let the panelists pick which ones they want to answer. So let's get started. I think I've got 2 hands here, and I've got 1 here and 1 here as well. Oh,
so I'll get right to it. Right now, technology is very much separated between people who grew up with a device in their hand and the parents or the older people in their lives who are trying to learn it. When advertising technological innovations, what biases or stereotypes are companies trying to educate older generations versus younger generations? What directions are companies moving in to educate the future consumer?
Very good. So advertising, especially with programmatic advertising, it can be very interesting to see how those genders get. And second question.
Hi, what do you think about access to internet as a human universal right?
We talked a little bit about who has access to internet as a right. Yes?
Hello? I'm struck by this idea that diversity is essential for innovation. But I was also thinking back to a session earlier this morning when the idea of the dirty little secret of development economy was shared, and the fact that all of these great theories and the knowledge we have now is going to take a great deal of time to bring to life. And I'm in the private sector. I have some influence. I was just wondering what someone like I can do now, if the panel has tips to, anything we can activate to address bias that exists in the organizations we work for right now.
Excellent. So the role of the private sector as well and biases. Maybe one more question, and then we'll let the panels choose which one they want to answer. Is there another one? Yes, thank you.
Thank you. If you could go deeper into regional inclusion, because I think one of the fundamental biases is also the fact that many of these companies are mainly based in the US, and there's a particular way of thinking, of viewing the world, where in many other places, as in Mexico, for example, there's another way, and in Africa and everywhere else. So if you could go deeper into that, please.
All right, so geographies, who wants to pick? And let's keep the answers short so we can finish with your statements as well.
So maybe to your point, the private sector role, and here I would say it's very, very important that we embed and we live the diversity topic and the inclusion as part of our values, our culture that we live, and we walk the talk across the organization. And introducing transformational mindset programs, but not only to develop and sharpen the leadership skills of our future potential female leaders, but also importantly, very important, is to engage men on the agenda. And we have very highly innovative programs like Mark, where we are having men advocating real change. These are the catalyst for transformational change. That is very, very important. And also bringing those life stories and sharing those life stories is very important. But also innovating on your model itself. And we talked about it yesterday. That really reflects on, are we an organization that is taking this serious? We need to even evolve in our way of operation, our way of partnership to address all of the issues, first with the pace of technology, but also of the accessibility to the technology to impact those patients' lives. So how can we become more innovative? And I like the first question was asked, where how can we advance within, when we talk about healthcare reform policies that are not really maybe matching with the speed of the innovation that is needed and required to reach to a patient. And therefore, innovation is not making its role and impact. And here we need a lot of innovative solutions around the healthcare reform policies.
Thank you. And another thing I've seen in the private sector, for example, is there's right now an artificial intelligence-powered language detector that removes biases in job descriptions and performance evaluations, for example. So we can turn around the technology as well. Other questions you might want to answer? Maybe one or two of you. And
so on the corporate side, I think practices are really, really important, and we just need to change the structure as quickly as we can. So I've seen when I in my hiring pipeline, I know it's really hard to hire women in AI. We should always reserve headcount, basically that's always open for recruiting women, for example. Managers need to be rewarded. Part of the reward system has to be on retention and promotion of female employees. So things like that, they're very rudimentary, very basic. You can put them into place right away, and you're going to start seeing results. Now, on the question of regional inclusion, I think we live in a world where we really need to start addressing that. We have North America, Europe, and at the same time we have over 1 million people in China, a majority of them without access to electricity. Right, so how can you even start talking about inclusion of those people who they're not online, they don't even have power. So I think from the point of view of G7, et cetera, we need to start thinking about a massive investment in infrastructure to bring people in online, basically give them basic human rights, energy, water, air, bring them knowledge, right? Access to knowledge. Access to internet is access to knowledge. So those are the kind of things that G7 should be discussing.
Very good. Very good. One of you?
I just want to echo the point here about from an organizational standpoint that we need to think about changing our structures and our processes and our business models, not just trying to change our brains as if somehow we can become unbiased. We really need to think about systems solutions, and that's going to require innovation in how we organize. I think that's actually the biggest innovation challenge that's out there right now.
Okay. Thank you.
And I'd just like to respond to the question about the geographical bias. It struck me that the new technology, Facebook and Google, were built in Silicon Valley, which is Northern California, largely of a particular ideological persuasion. I'd call it libertarian. I was part of a compassion team that was very thankfully built by somebody from Mexico. I wish people from Mexico had built Facebook. It'd be different. And it grew to 300 people, so we need people from much different cultural perspectives to shape these technologies.
Thank you very much. I see the time has run out to finish on the advertising question. There were initiatives from some of the big platforms. For example, when you search for powerful women on Google, last night I searched for women firefighter versus man firefighter. You can imagine the kind of pictures you get. A foundation was basically feeding into the system other types of pictures so that after a search, very different kind of outcome would come on the way women would portray themselves, for example, which I found interesting. We're unfortunately out of time. Clearly, there are a lot of questions. Our panelists will be here for the rest of the day as well. Get a chance to check with them from the different angles. Thank you for your energy and your participation, and I'll see you later.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.